Welcome to Discovering. I'm in Delta County for a look at the return of the black tern.
I'm at the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula. I'm out sightseeing with the folks from the Keweenaw ATV Club, and we're talking about the trails that they maintain and they hope to keep maintaining for years to come.
Stick around, that's all tonight, right here on Discovering.
The secret streams that flow beneath the cliffs of colored stone. Forest thick and healthy with birch and pine and oak. Surrounded by the greatest lakes this world has ever known. The black bear's awesome presence as he roams the hills and fields. Call of the timber wolf, the loon's lonesome trill. The eagle soaring high above, the trout lies deep and still. These are what I treasure, the only way I measure feelings that I have for this fine land. There is so much to discover when you're a long-time lover of northern Michigan.
Here we go, here's an adult right here. So there's two pairs that are nesting at the mouth of the creek here, Portage Marsh. And so both of these have young that are fully fledged. And they're colonial nesters, so when they get an intruder, whether it be a heron or a boat, canoer, whatever, they'll come and do like alarm calls. But since we're in the middle of the channel, black tern doesn't need a lot of excuse to be upset. Hey, this morning we're in the Portage Marsh outside of Escanaba, Michigan, and we're celebrating a success of sorts. This is the first time that black terns have successfully nested in the Portage Marsh in at least 20 years. Primary reason for that is for the last 15 years, Portage Marsh has been almost bone dry as far as water, and this is a bird that requires floating dead debris in order to place their nests. They're the smallest of the terns that nest in Michigan. There's 4 other species. The other 3, foresters, common tern, and Caspian tern, all nest on rocky shoals and sandy islands. But black terns are unique. They're mostly a prairie species, but they did formerly range throughout Michigan, but declines in the Great Lakes have been about 70% decline in the last 30 years. So now that we have them back in the Portage Marsh, it's something to celebrate. As birds were recruiting into the colony, sometimes you'd find like the primo habitat was already taken, and so the marginal areas didn't really have enough vegetative mats. So we started putting out these little PVC platforms, and we were finding that the terns would take to them, and we're using time-lapse cameras to actually monitor the success of the nests of these platforms. So basically what we were finding in Ogons Bay as water levels came up, there was a limited amount of dead vegetative mats that were suitable for nesting. So the birds that were coming in early were occupying those nests, and they're fairly tolerant since they're colonial water birds, but they were filling out probably every 10 meters or so. Some of them were actually less. And that provides protection for the whole colony. But there was a limited number of mats, so what we did was make these little PVC squares, 9-inch squares with foam in the middle, and we were putting those kind of on the outskirts of the colony. And what we were finding in like late July, mid-July, that new birds were coming in, settling on those platforms, and then laying eggs and being successful hatching off of those platforms. And what we found is the larger ones that we did, the 2-foot square that really worked well in Wisconsin, didn't tend to do well in a high-use marsh like this because we get muskrats on them. Sometimes herons would land on them. So what we did is we shrank it down based on the size of a natural tern nest, which is about 9 inches square. And when we put those out, they worked fantastic. We didn't have a single failure on any of those nests, determined by time-lapse photography. The terns will nest on floating debris, but they'll also use like old muskrat dens and things like that. But they're at risk when they use something, substrate that's harder, because of things like muskrats. We had mallards that would come and roost with their young, and that was displacing the terns. So they had no interest in the tern nest. They just had interest in the same spot the tern was using for nesting. So it rolled eggs into the water. Now with such high water, you know, a site like Ogons doesn't really have any available habitat. But fortunately, like this year, after an absence of at least 20 years, Portage Marsh all of a sudden has black terns. So the quality of the habitat for these guys is going to be determined what happens over the winter. So if these cattails, if we don't get an ice shear or heavy snow to push down this season's growth, these birds won't have vegetative mats to nest on. So like last November, we had a really heavy early snow and ice conditions that kind of sheared off the cattails. So you could see across this entire cattail marsh, it looked like it was completely open. This is all this year's growth. So if you can get snow, heavy snow loads to push all this down, it makes for great substrate, not only for nesting terns. I mean, terns are just a sensitive indicator, but that also works for ducks and grebes and other water birds, coots, rails. You really need the floating mat, last year's dead vegetation, to create good habitat for these birds. So, you know, one of the management tools that we're considering, because our winters become more mild, is going in on the interior of these cattail marshes during the winter and basically shearing off these stems, this year's growth, to let it pile up, because then it'll be available in the spring for these birds for nesting. There we go. See, it's young? Right there. Just took out of the cattails. You see, these guys are molting. So they're end of the season, and so when these black terns return in the spring, they're jet black below, except for under the tail is immaculate white. Their wings are gray, the top side. But after they're done with nesting, you know, as hormone levels go down, decrease, birds, because they fly, they have to replace their feathers. So you'll start noticing these birds molt. And another really great example is like the breeding plumage of common loon. You know, they're black and white and expressive in the summertime. In the winter, when they're down on the ocean, they're just gray and white like so many other seabirds. So people that live up here, when I talk to them about, oh yeah, our loons winter in Florida, and they say I never see loons, because they're looking for breeding plumage loons. Same thing happens with these terns. And you'll notice the adults, their faces will start to turn white, and then they'll replace all the black feathers. That black breeding plumage will be completely replaced with white, so that they almost look like the juveniles, which are all white below and gray above. But the difference is the juveniles have a shorter forked tail and there's no black underneath. Next year's birds, you see them occasionally back in the breeding grounds, but the majority of those birds probably stay on winter territory, down on the ocean, and then will return the year after in this full sort of black and white plumage ready for breeding. So life history of the black terns, at least in this area, is fairly straightforward. You'll get birds returning from Central and South America. They'll make it up here for breeding, usually about middle of May. So peak breeding up here on the northern lakes and in these coastal estuaries, these coastal marshes, is typically like the first week of June. And if a pair of adults are successful, they'll lay 3 eggs on a floating mat, and it takes 3 weeks to hatch the chicks. And then another 3 weeks of feeding them dragonflies and small minnows and beetles to get them to the fledging state. And then once they fledge, typically families or birds move out pretty quickly, and then it's right back down to Central and South America for the winter.
Because I don't spend enough time in the Keweenaw, I met up with the Keweenaw ATV Club in Copper Harbor for some sightseeing on the Keweenaw Point, or what I would call it, the End of the Earth Tour. I jumped into a fancy, enclosed, air-conditioned side-by-side with Club President Daryl St. John for a day of riding and checking out sights that I had never seen before.
The ATV Club manages about 168 miles of trails here. Our annual budget runs around $100,000 that we've been putting into these trails. We have an excellent club. We've got some hardworking members. They're out there policing trails, cutting brush, putting up signs.
The trails today were along a lot of logging roads that are maintained by the ATV Club. A lot of this property is owned by TRG, who have allowed the ATV Club to build and maintain trails through them in order to access these state-owned sites throughout the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula.
The land company understands the economic importance of the trail system, not just to ATVs, but to snowmobiles, to hikers, bikers.
It has been a hot and dry summer here in the UP, and the trails are dusty. The first stop on our tour is the old Clark Mine site, 3 miles southeast of Copper Harbor. The Clark Mine operated from 1853 to 1901. The smokestack of the copper mine's powerhouse is all that remains at this historic site.
So many little of these sites around, that nobody ever sees anymore. And that was the whole idea of our ATV trail system, is to connect all of this stuff. So in essence, we've been working about 24 years on this, 25 years. It's taken us that long to put everything together to make it possible for everybody to come up.
We took a quick stop on a bridge over the Montreal River before venturing on to Hoare Lake.
Why we got our trail system is because there's a wilderness campsite back here, and then this will be the motorized campsite here. This is the state property. The state owns it right around the lake. TRG owns into it. So
do a fall and a spring ATV ride, and this is one of the places we stop. Pretty nice.
I always said we got the 3 T's up here that we live on: tech, Michigan Tech, tourism, and trees.
From Hoare Lake, we traveled to the Lake Superior shoreline to Fish Cove.
The club paid for the turnaround, the road development on the way in. You come through the state of Michigan property, probably about a mile back, and then it comes into Conservancy property. Michigan Nature Association here owns all this, and we had an agreement with them that if we did all of this, that they would give us access to the beach. So that's what we did.
From here, you can see the shores of Bay de Gris and Mount Baldy. Stop number 5 on our End of the Earth tour took us to Schlatter Lake, the last inland lake at the end of the peninsula.
That's an island out there, and they go camping out there. It's the state owns the whole thing. The road actually goes around the other side of this lake.
On our way to our next stop, Daryl and I took a little detour to the Keweenaw Rocket Range, a site I recently learned about and was on my UP bucket list.
From the 50s right into the mid-70s, in conjunction with the Air Force and NASA, they shot rockets into the atmosphere. It's the first place in the state of Michigan to actually put a rocket into space. Was right from here, way out on the Keweenaw Point.
Just around the corner from the Keweenaw Rocket Range was our final stop, High Rock, the end of the trail at the tip of the Keweenaw. It was a long ride out here and worth the journey. Places I'd always wanted to see, but not sure I would have found without this group of tour guides on ATVs. So the primary purpose of today's tour was for the Keweenaw ATV Club to show me the trails and sites that the public could potentially lose access to if the lands owned by TRG in the Keweenaw are sold to private landowners. Ultimately, they would like the state of Michigan to purchase the lands for the public to keep access to these trails and scenic spots.
We're on state property right here, but the only way to access it is on the ATV trails through the logging company land.
Hopefully the people of the UP want this trail system to exist. We've worked probably 25 years on this trail system now, on and off, snowmobile and ATV, more so ATV in the last 15 years. The current owner is a logging company, investment firm, and they're getting ready to sell. And most of our trails are on their property. They've been really good to us. And American Forest Management is the timber company managing it. And they've been really good to us in the last 15, 20 years, permitting us to have a trail system. So we've accomplished a few things. The club itself has made provisions that we can actually use state funds on private trails. That's something that this club managed to do. And with the help of the DNR, everything is with the help of the DNR naturally, but we pushed it and got that available. So what that does is it makes funds available for trails, cleanup, culverts, ditching, removal of trees, whatever, and signage and insurance. So it opened up a whole new thing for the ATV club so we could get our trails up here. And basically what we did is we followed the snowmobile trail system, which existed before we did, and we just followed them. And we don't have all trails that the snowmobile do, but we have most. So from that point on, what's happened now is the company is selling the parent company is selling the land, and the land includes most of our trails, probably a good 85% of our trails. So we're in a real quandary about, hopefully the state of Michigan will buy these parcels and preserve the work that we've done with state funding. And there's a lot of money put into these trails. You don't always see it, but just the maintenance on any dirt road is really, really expensive. And we're a volunteer club, 501c3. We've done this for a long time. But this is our worry, is that the state of Michigan maybe isn't paying attention to us. And this is pretty much from what we've seen, a good 85% of the people are on board with to keep the existing trail system here. Because if we lose it, we lose beautiful sites like here, and that we viewed today on and off. There's a couple of spots that we can't get to because they're still logging on that road, but anyway, that's pretty much it. It's straightforward. We need help, and we need people on our side, and we need people calling Lansing and the DNR and our governor and letting them know we need this to happen, because we're in jeopardy of losing it. If it goes private, there's always the chance we can lose it.
It would take someone buying 40 acres where the main trail crosses, shutting it down, we lose the entire Keweenaw. The purchase area is around 15,500 acres. I don't know the current value, what the land company is asking for, but honestly, at any price, it's a bargain because of the economic impact of the entire area. The Keweenaw has trees and trails. That's the big marketing here. It's a tourist area. The best thing we can do is to upgrade our facilities to attract more tourists. We just need the support of not only the state, but we need support from the DNR to push through this acquisition. We've been pushing for 5 years for this purchase to go through. It started out that the land company offered to swap land for the area in the Keweenaw for points south. And that was met with some resistance because it seemed to be a difficult proposition to pass. Then it was suggested by a former representative that we just use the state recreational funds and just do an outright purchase. And that's been the avenue that we've been following the past few years.
If the people don't say anything, it doesn't go through, well, they've lost their trail system. We've done pretty much everything we can do. We've gotten trails into Eagle Harbor, Copper Harbor, Gay, Calumet, Lake Linden, Copper Harbor. We've pretty much done it. So this is due time now.
Well, that's it for this week. Be sure to check out 906outdoors.com, where you'll find the 906 Fishing Report, TV6 weather, shopping, and more. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next week right here on Upper Michigan's very own Discovering.